Om Stapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. So we are continuing to discuss this important school of philosophy in Buddhist tradition, especially in the Mahayana tradition, though apparently it is the most important and most well-known system of Buddhist thoughts. And especially Nagarjuna is considered to be the greatest philosopher during the post-Buddha period of the history of Buddhism. Interestingly, we already discussed this concept of Shunya. So this idea of some transcendental reality which is beyond body-mind complex is a common doctrine, a tenet in Buddhism and also in Advaita. In a broader sense, in Vedantic traditions, it is called Dehendriya Vedriktitvam, means something that is distinct from body-mind complex. Deha Indriya Vedriktitvam, the characteristic of being totally distinct from the body-mind complex, the empirical, the gross dimension of a personality. And both Advaitins and Buddhism, especially Shunyavada, and in a broader sense, all the schools of Buddhism, both Sautrantika and Vaibhashikas, belonging to Hinayana tradition, and also Vijnanavada and Shunyavada, belonging to Mahayana tradition. They all accept that there is a degree of imperfection with regard to a present status when we identify ourselves with this physical body and all the experiences that we go through this body-mind complex, maybe going through mind and the five senses of perception. We go through many experiences. So this state is not the ultimate, not the highest status that we can achieve. We have a higher reality, we have a higher dimension, or rather, our reality has a higher transcendental dimension. And this condition of not being able to identify with our true nature is called bondage in Vedanta, in the same sense, dukkha in Buddhism. So in Advaita Vedanta, in Jivatma Buddhi, when we identify our true self with our body-mind complex, it is a kind of bondage. We should get out of it, and we can get out of it only when we realize, not just cognize, but realize in our own life our true nature. And it is called moksha or liberation in Vedanta, specifically in Advaita Vedanta. In Buddhism and in a general way, especially in Shunyavada tradition, Nagarjuna in his Mula Madhyama Karika and Chandrakirti's well-known commentary called Prasanna Pada. That's the most well-known, perhaps the only complete commentary available on Mula Madhyama Shastram. Chandrakirti's well-known commentary or Tika called Prasanna Pada. And according to Nagarjuna, we get out of this dukkha or imperfection, or you may call it bondage if you want to use the language of the Vedantins. We can get out of this only when we realize the Four Noble Truths. In fact, Nagarjuna has written an entire chapter on Arya Satya Pariksha, one of the most celebrated chapters in the Mula Madhyama Shastram, Madhyamika Karika, 27 chapters, where he discusses and examines the Four Noble Truths. And he says that the first stage is to realize that there is this dukkha. This again is possible only for a person who is somewhat enlightened. See, a normal human being who is happy living in this world, wonderful things to eat and wonderful place to live in, He doesn't feel the need to identify with some kind of a transcendental entity. He will be considered to be crazy actually in the normal sense of the term. So Vyasa in his commentary on the sutra, Parinama Tapa Samskara Dukkaihi Guna Visheshacha Dukkameva Sarvam Vivekinaha. So there Vyasa says the Parinama Dukkha, I mean this realization of the present predicament of our identifying ourselves with our body-mind complex, it is a state of imperfection that itself has a transformative effect or impact on our life. It leads to our evolution and further growth. It's the beginning of a spiritual journey. He says, Yoginameva Krishnati. He says that can happen only to yogis, in the sense those who want to look beyond the empirical. In the Yoga Sutra, Atha Yoga Anuशाsanam. We turn to yoga only when we have exhausted ourselves, knocking at every other door in search of eternal peace. And when we find this world cannot offer that, then we turn to yoga. We turn to spiritual inquiry in broader sense. So, and Vedantins call it Atyanta Dukkha Nivrittihi and Niratisaya Sukha Avaptihi. That's called realizing our true nature and also attaining our eternal spiritual realization. And Buddhists call it cessation of all suffering through direct recognition, but not Swarupa of the need to go out of this bondage and then practicing eightfold disciplines like Samyak Drishti, Samyak Vyayama, Samyak Sankalpa, Samyak Ajiva, Samyak Smriti, Samyak Samadhi, and so on. Right concentration, right effort, right livelihood, right action, right speech, Samyak walk, etc. And then you reach through Samyak Samadhi, you attain Nirvana. This is a scheme in Buddhism. So you can see some kind of a identity or agreement and also some difference. Now, in Buddha's words, you can find something very interesting. Buddha himself was not very sure that people will not misunderstand his teaching. So in one of the chapters I mentioned, it is Arya Satya Pariksha, 24th chapter of Mula Madhyama Shastra. Maybe verse number 10 or 11. Verse number 11. Arya Satya Pariksha. That is examination or maybe verifying or re-examining the Four Noble Truths, Sattvari Arya Satyani. There, Nagarjuna refers to this idea, and in Nagarjuna's own words, Vinasayadi Durdrushta Shunyavada Mandamedhasam Sarpo Yatha Dugrhito Vidya Ya Dushprasadhida. So, Buddha, when he attained his nirvana in Bodh Gaya, you know his story. Buddha was a prince in one of the small kingdoms with Nepal and Lumpini, and then he was 28 years or maybe 30 years, and one day he felt that there are many terrible things in this world like old age, death, and sickness and so on, which he was not allowed to experience by his parents, who he was kept imprisoned in a environment of absolute luxury. So he had no right and he had no opportunity to connect with the real world outside the palace. So when he was just about 28 years or maybe slightly older, he was taken out on a ride in a chariot by his servant, and at that time he saw three visions which opened his eyes to certain dark realities of human existence like old age, death and sickness. And then he wanted to find an answer to this problem, and life was not all that luxurious all the time, as she was forced to believe, because she was not allowed to come out to the palace, had to stay in the luxurious surroundings all the time. So anyway, so he left his palace, walked about 1200 miles or maybe longer in those days to Bodh Gaya in today's Bihar state, and sat under a tree and he meditated. In the, I think in the Lalita Vistara somewhere, in the Buddha Vijaya, it said, Ihasane sushyatu me sharidam tagasti mamsam cha vilayam cha yatuhu aprapya siddhim bahu janma durlabham naivasanat kayamatas chalishyati. So let my body perish, it will be reduced to asti mamsam cha vilayam cha yatuhu. Let it be reduced to skin, bones and marrow. Still I won't get up from the seat before I attain liberation. And eventually he attained liberation, and he straight away walked to Kashi, and there he started his sermons. This is a story. Now after attaining this supreme truth, he was not sure that those whom he was instructing, who was teaching, would clearly understand the essence of his teaching. And Nagarjuna is implying that Buddha realized Shunyata. So Nirvana for Nagarjuna means Shunyata. So, and then people won't understand that everything is empty if you use the word English language. After all, how can you meditate on emptiness? I want to attain emptiness. Something like, I want to become a great pauper, totally bankrupt. That is not a transcendental goal you are seeking in your life, spiritual life. So obviously, Buddha was not talking about emptiness when he was talking about the spiritual goal of humanity. So in this verse, Nagarjuna plays a very clever twist. He is putting this idea, and his own Shunya concept, Shunya the empty concept, can be terribly misunderstood, and Nagarjuna's fear was completely justified. For almost maybe 1800 years, right, from his passing away. He lived in second, third century AD, almost for 2000 years. The world had fully succeeded in misunderstanding Nagarjuna and misunderstanding Buddha. So this verse tells you, Vinasheri Dudrushta Shunyada Mandamedhasam. Mandameda means somebody whose intellect is not ready, not well evolved to clearly understand the implication of Shunya. So Medha is not just intellect, measured in terms of IQ. It is a skill of the intellect. When our mind and intellect develop a higher capacity to understand, at least intellectually, the subtle spiritual truths, which a man of 130, 140 IQ may not be able to understand at all. Absolutely no. If a brilliant scientist who has got an IQ 140, if he reads this Nagarjuna's book, he will dismiss the whole thing as absolute gibberish. It's not that he doesn't have intellect, but because he doesn't have Medha. Medha is the ability to understand subtle spiritual truths. And it requires not only intellect understood in modern psychological sense, but rather a type of higher, purified, refined intellect. Then only we can feel an attraction to spiritual ideas, not just intellect. A very good intellect in terms of IQ can easily grasp some of the great scientific, technological truths in physics, chemistry, mathematics. But that intellect may dismiss a spiritual truth as absolutely meaningless. On the other hand, a good man, his way of thinking, because the emotional system is pure, then what happens, then he's able to connect with the higher spiritual realities in life. So Buddha says, Vinashiyadi durdrishta shunyata mandamedasam sarpo yatha durgrihitaha vidya ya dusprasadida. Suppose somebody catches, let's say, a rope, thinking that, or rather, sorry, I'm giving the example. Suppose somebody grabs a serpent, a snake that is lying on the grass, thinking that it is a rope, a green colored rope. It is the opposite of Rijusarpa Bhranti in Vedanta. This is the opposite Buddha uses. Suppose somebody takes in his hands a snake, the tail of a snake, thinking that it is part of a rope. What happens? Very dangerous. Sarpo yatha durgrihita. No. What happens? It can be dangerous. And also, a knowledge that's not properly learned, that is one interpretation. The other interpretation is somebody who has to work hard to catch a snake, somebody who has to work hard to study a language, to study something or to attain learning. So different interpretations are there. But the first statement is very, very obvious, without need for any illustration. Those whose intellect is not purified enough to fully understand the subtle implication of Shunyada, it's just like a person who is catching hold of the tail of a snake, thinking that it is a rope. It can be dangerous because a person who has not fully understood can certainly get into trouble, and he can also bring trouble to other people. Now, in this tradition, in Buddhist tradition, there are many sutras, Prajna Paramita Sutra, and so there are many, many sutras. Sutra in Sanskrit, sutta maybe in Pali. Sutra is a pithy statement. Alpaksharam asadigdam Vishuddhamukham. So that means Alpaksharam. It should be a small statement. Asandigdham. It should make a statement without any doubt. Saravat Vishuddhamukham. It should be capable of elaborate, all-comprehensive interpretation. It should have a definite meaning, Saravat. So, Alpaksharam, Asandigdham, Saravat, Vishuddhamukham. Then, again, at the same time, it should be capable of fully establishing a definite spiritual, philosophical truth through its interpretation. So, that is called the sutra. Now, one of the well-known sutras is known as this Prajna Paramita Sutra. So, of course, normally people study the smaller version called Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. It's called Heart Sutra. Because according to traditions, there are versions of the sutra which has got 100,000 verses. It could Shata Sagasrika Prajna Paramita, then Panjavimshati Sagasrika, 25,000 verses, and like that, Ashta Sagasrika. But normally people pay attention only to this Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. It's called Heart Sutra. Now, the order, now talking about the order, it is not attributed to a definite single teacher order. but it is supposed to be a discourse by one of the Bodhisattvas. And the Bodhisattva's name is Avalokiteshvara. Now, Bodhisattva, who is Bodhisattva? Bodhisattva is a being, somebody who has attained nirvana, liberation, enlightenment. But he chooses to remain in the realm of dukkha, to help others. So, Buddha himself went through innumerable life cycles. In each of these life cycles, he was a Bodhisattva. So, Avalokiteshvara is a well-known name in this tradition. He is a Bodhisattva of compassion. So, it is a very, very important sutra in the Mahayana Buddhism, especially the Heart Sutra. It should be properly understood before we enter into the broader literature of Mahayana tradition. So, what he does is, but Avalokiteshvara, we are going to discuss that sutra itself. It's in Sanskrit. Of course, it took various forms in different languages when it went to Tibet, when it went to China, Japan, many countries. This Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra, it became highly localized. So, Bodhisattva or Avalokiteshvara himself got different names in different language traditions outside India. So, the idea is, in the sutra is, Avalokiteshvara teaches a great Buddhist bhikshu called Shariputra is teaching about the concept of emptiness. And what he is teaching is this: the entire empirical phenomena, especially the 5 skandhas aggregates, that is form, feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. Rupa, Vedana, cognition, etc. Samjna, Vijnana, etc. All these are all devoid of any permanent existence, or they are empty of inherent eternal existence. So, it's a very straightforward sutra, and finally, towards the end of the sutra, the teacher, he puts together the transcendental wisdom, gate gate paragate, etc. You find this is supposed to be a great tool for spiritual liberation, because when you read this and when you meditate on this, you get the feeling that all that you see or hear or touch or smell around you, they are coming and going every split second. So, they are emerging, they are arising and they are ceasing to exist. So, Utpada Nirodha. So, because it is always in a flux, it is devoid of any permanent existence. The sutra is this. Now, there are of course other bodhisattvas also in Buddha tradition. For example, there is one, Avalokiteshvara is the most well-known one because of this sutra, because he is a bodhisattva of compassion. Manjusri is another bodhisattva, is a bodhisattva of wisdom. Then Vajrapani, another bodhisattva, is a bodhisattva of power and protection. So these are all different ideas that began to evolve in Mahayana Buddhism, most probably from 1st century BC onwards. So you find so many deities like Devis and Devadas, we call in Sanskrit. So many deities emerged in Buddhist tradition, and they chant these mantras. But the Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra is very powerful. So, for Om Namo Bhagavate Arya Prajna Paramitayi. So, Prajna Paramita is taken to be a female deity. The literal meaning of the expression is Prajna means wisdom. Paramita means the highest, most sublime, the highest transcendent, the peak of wisdom. The perfection of wisdom. That's the literal meaning of this word. But this Prajna Paramita not only is a name of a sutra, but also is the name of a female deity. So they chant this mantra. You can find in many Mahayana traditions this physical presentation of Prajna Paramita. So you can imagine people who normally begin any kind of discussion on Buddhism will tell you Buddhism say there is nothing in this world, everything is an illusion, they don't believe in God, they don't believe in images, they don't believe in prayer. You can find all this, but if you go to any Buddhist, any authentic Buddhist place of worship, you can find so many deities. Most probably these are all, as we mentioned, different great men and women. Arya Manjusri Mulakalpa. Manjusri is a feminine name actually. Prajna Paramita itself is a feminine gender. So it's a long vowel, Prajna Paramita. I mean a female divine archetype reflecting or representing the highest spiritual wisdom. Something like Medha. In the Yajurveda, there is a Sutra Medha, Devi, Jushamana, Agasa. So this purified intellect is elevated to the status of a divine feminine archetype, divine deity. So it begins like this, for example, first the Avilokiteshvara begins his discussion. So he was practicing this Prajna Paramita for a long time. What happened was, first he perceived that all the 5 skandhas are empty, which means all the panchaskandhas, so all panchaskandhas are, form, then feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are all empty, means they do not have any permanent lasting entity. They come and go. In the sense, they don't really exist except in the relative plane. The idea behind. So he says, Arya Vilokiteshwaraha Bodhisattvaha Gabhirayam Prajna Paramitayam Charyamano Vyavaloka Yadisma. So he was he was practicing this profound meditation, Gabhirayam, Prajna Paramitayam Charyamano. He was compassionate with this great deity of compassion. He was immersed in deep meditation on Prajna Paramita. And then what he did? Charyamanaha Vyavalokyadisma Panchaskandhaha Tamscha Subhava Sunyan Pashyadisma. So what happened? Then he realized all the 5 skandhas, aggregates, that is feelings, perception, impulses, consciousness, etc., form, etc. They are all empty of any inherent existence. Ika Shari Putra Rupam Shunyadaiva Rupam Rupanna Pruthak Shunyada Shunyadaya Hanna Pruthak Rupam Yad Rupam Sa Shunyada Ya Shunyada Tad Rupam Eva Eva Vedana Samjna Samskarha Vijnana. All the 5 skandhas. Not only Rupam, but also Vedana, Samjna, Samskarha, Vijnana, etc. That means feelings, perception, impulses, and consciousness. Ikachari Putra Sarvadharmaha Suni Lakshana. Anutpanna, Aniruddha, Amala, Bimala, Anuna, Aparipurna. So practically it's again putting in different language, a much more sublime language, the idea of Chaduskodi Nivrittatu means transcending Chaduskodi. When Nagarjuna negates Chaduskodi in Madhyamika Karika, Gaudapada again negates Chaduskodi, means four possible prepositions. Thus again is coming there. So that's a way to intellectually understand Shunyata. So all these things, they come and go, therefore they do not constitute any eternal reality. Tasma shari putra sunyatayam narubam navedana na samjnana samskara na vijnanam chakshusot na chakshu sotram ghranam jikhva kayo manah na rupam na shabdaha na gandhaha na rasaha na sparsha na dharma na chakshu na dhatu yavat na manovijnana dhatu na vidya vidyakshayo yavat na janamaranam na janamaranakshayah na dukkha samudaya nirodha marga na jnanam na praptihi etc. Na praptihi etc. You can find it is continued. So it is something that is used for chanting, and chanting with a deep sense of sanctity and sacredness, with a sense of meditation. Now, can you ever believe that these great monks and nuns, and of course, Buddhism is, in those days at least, now it's different, but traditionally Buddhism had a strong monastic orientation. And also laymen, of course, there were great many laymen, devotees also. So they were all practicing meditation, and then it's called Mahamantra, Prajna Paramita Mahamantra. It comes at the end. It is a Mahamantra, a great mantra, a great prayer, or great statement on which they meditate. Can it mean emptiness? As we understand that word emptiness in an English language dictionary. That's the point which I want to stress. So, Buddha's fear was very genuine. Buddha's apprehension that what he realized, if he ever taught the world, will be totally lost because of a wrong interpretation or misapprehension. And to give the example, somebody who catching the tail of a snake thinking that's a rope, the opposite of rope snake analogy in Vedanta. There are different interpretations, but the first statement, as I mentioned earlier, vinasedi dudrushta sunyada mantamedasam. Dudrushta means somebody who had perceived it in a very wrong manner. Somebody who had misunderstood the actual implication, the experienced dimension of Shunya. Because Buddha had just realized it, that Shunyata, after long years of meditation. After renouncing everything, he meditated and realized, and he felt he had attained nirvana. He wanted to teach, then he was not sure that if we had taught people, they will actually understand it properly, or maybe misunderstood, or maybe they are likely to misinterpret in future. So when you read this, you can see it is not something that we make this made as a statement. It is the outer expression of an inner experience. That's what we are talking. It's an outer expression of an inner experience. And no outer expression can do full justice to an inner experience. An outer expression is only an attempt to explain what really cannot be explained. So it's almost 14 verses if you analyze it, if you study it as a verse, but again maybe it can be called 20 sections, 20 statements. So, Astova Manavadyam cha Sutram Sutra Vido Viduhu. When a Sutra, it is Sutra, Prajnaparamita Sutra. So, Sutra will be brief statement, it will be very brief statement. Alpaksharam, Asandhiktam. But when you understand it, you have no doubt about it. Saravat Vishwato Mukham. It's very profound in its meaning. And it may have very comprehensive implication. Astobham anavadyam cha saram sutram sutra vido viduhu. So the point is, we should take it as a word formation, if you take it that way, to be meditated upon. And then when we meditate, it is no more a word formation, it is a spiritual journey. So somebody who is profoundly in meditation, sitting in meditation, he realizes that all the panchaskandhas, the form, perception, cognition, awareness or consciousness, all these 5 skandhas, everything else in this world, they come and go. They are all empty of any inherent existence. Again, this is not a statement, it is an experience. So, again he continues, Tasmat apraptitvad bodhisattvanam prajnaparamidam asritya viharati chintavaranaha astitvad atra stadu viparyasatvandu Nisreya nirvana praptihi trigala jnana praptaha sarvabuddhaha prajnaparamidam asritya anuttaram samyak sambodhim abhisambuddhaha tasmajnadavyam prajnaparamidam mahamantraha Mahavidya mantraha, anuttama mantraha, asama samantraha, sarva dukkha prashamanaha. Sarva dukkha prashamanaha, it destroys all dukkha. Satyam abhidhyanatvad. So this is the important, this is a very, very important sutra. I took up this because not to teach this because it's not easy, but to make an idea that a simple sutra which has got maybe 14 verses or 20 statements, not exactly in a metrical form, it doesn't follow a particular metric like Gita or other books. But again, it is just a verbal statement which is used for reading with a great sense of sanctity and sacredness for meditation. So what this sutra is telling you is simple. First of all, it gives an illustration of the concept of shunyata. That is, it emphasizes the absence of any inherent, independent, absolute reality. Everything in this phenomena is empty of any permanent existence, and also they are dependent. That is praditya samutpada, dependent origination. The first thing is, form is emptiness, the 5 skandhas is emptiness. The duality is also denied here. Distinctions of life and death, purity, impurity, asti, nasti, being, non-being, all these are negated. Which means when you negate all this, what you feel is the feeling, the experience of shunya. This was what Buddha actually wanted to teach the world. So that shunyada, the shunya aspect, the fundamental truth of anarthavada, which actually you find in Vedantic tradition in the analysis of Vyavakarika Satta. But Buddha did not emphasize the fact of relative existence of the empirical. Rather, he emphasized the absence of absolute reality of the empirical. I hope it's clear. Buddha did not say that the world never exists at all. He only said the world is not an absolute permanent entity. So when you understand Shunyada, what it implies is this world or all the experiences that we have with our mind and the five senses of perception, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell, all these, they do not have an absolute permanent reality. He emphasized that. What Shankara mentioned, along with emphasizing the absence of absolute reality of empirical phenomena, he also made a statement, but they do have a relative entity. They do have a relative existence. But in Buddhism, the fact of the relativity of empirical phenomena is to be experienced by meditation, either Zen meditation or chanting of these mantras. It doesn't, no Buddhist who meditates will tell you that he is not having a lunch. If he is having a lunch, he won't say, no, I am not having a lunch. He won't say that. And somebody who is traveling in a plane, no, I am not traveling. Nobody will say that. In Advaita, they will tell you, well, I am eating food now, I am traveling now. This experience is not an absolute. It isn't an absolute entity. It is an empirical. It's a relative entity, relative reality, not absolute reality. So in Buddhism, the relativity of the relative is to be experienced by these meditative practices. That's why Nagarjuna says, Samvriddhi Satyam, Paramartha Satyam. Nagarjuna also, I already explained this earlier. In the Madhyamika Karika, he says, Dve Satye Samupasritya Buddhanam Dharmadeshana Loka Samvriddhi Satyam cha Paramarthadaha. Very powerful statement. So, Nagarjuna accepts the relative empirical existence of Samvriddhi. Samvriddhi means empirical, the relative, but only relative, not only empirical, not transcendental, not permanent. When Buddha's own teachings, you find in his dialogues, for example, in fact, one of his most well-known disciples was Ananda, and one of the Avalokiteshvara, one of the Bodhisattvas are considered to be one of the incarnations of Ananda, according to Buddhist myths, mythology. But Buddha only emphasized the absence of anything permanent in this empirical world. But Shankara emphasized the reality of something totally absolute. That total absolute, the Paramarthika Satta, was called Shunya in Nagarjuna's philosophy. But again, the Shunya is not what we normally mean by the English translation, emptiness. That's the only problem. So that's why, but again, according to Mahayana Buddhist, this sutra will tell you to go beyond, to see through the illusion. Well, first of all, you recognize your own empirical body-mind complex, form, sensation, perception, mental formations and consciousness. Rupa, Vedana, Samkhya, Samskara, Vijnana, all these five skandhas, consciousness. They are all impermanent. And again, they are interdependent, like Pratitya Samutpada. So therefore, they do not constitute a permanent, fixed entity. So this realization, again not intellectual understanding, this realization will put an end to our craving, clinging to some body, desires, which are part of the 12-link chain, which constitute Pratitya Samutpada. When this happens, we are out of dukkha. We are out of bondage. In Vedanta, when we realize we are not these empirical things, we are not emptiness as understood, we are not these relative things, we are the absolute. Actually, we have to keep in mind all the time, Nagarjuna does believe in an absolute transcendental reality. It's called Dvesatya Samupasitya Buddhanam Logadeshanam. Then Loka Sambuddhi Satyam Satyam Paramarthataka. There are two types of truths, the empirical and also the non-empirical, the absolute, the permanent. And that permanent truth is Shunya. Now if you call the Shunya emptiness, English emptiness, then only the problem. If we can actually replace all these translations with the Sanskrit word is Shunya, everything will be obvious. That's the point. And again, it is not Western or modern English, Indian English translators who are at fault. Many of the Vedantins also, in their debates with Buddhists, they also interpreted Nagarjuna's Shunya as something like what we mean by English word emptiness. So, it didn't start recently. Even in the debates between Advaitins and Shunyavadins and Vijnanavadins, you can see this conflict. And also the great comparative philosopher, Madhavacharya, he wrote this Sarvadarshana Sangraha I mentioned. It's one of the important foundational books for understanding many different types of Indian philosophical systems. He lived in the 13th century, roughly about 1,000 years or 900 years after Nagarjuna. So he also interprets Shunyavada as something like emptiness, as understood in English. So it's not a new trend. So Shunya is not what we mean by the English word emptiness. Again, it helps you. The sutra, if you meditate and seriously read, it helps you to attain freedom from attachment. Because nobody wants to be attached to something that is obviously changing all the time. It's just empirical, just momentary, just phenomenal. So it can help us to remain detached with our own five skandhas, body, mind, complex. And when we are detached with our body, mind, complex, when we understand these are all part of the 12-link chain, praditya samudpada, coming and going, again reappearing, then we will be free from clinging, desire. And that can eventually take us out of dukkha, out of this birth, death and rebirth. That's why Jara, Marana, etc. all in the Avalokiteshvara's discussion towards the end you find as. Again, this understanding emptiness can help us to attain nirvana. When there is no more obsession, clinging and desire, then there will be no more rebirth. So then we attain nirvana. So this is a very interesting, very famous and very powerful statement. It should be understood only as a sutra, not a poetic work, because it doesn't follow any metrical form like Gita and other important literary classics like Mahabharata, Ramayana or anything. It simply is the first step towards detaching ourselves from the Panchaskandhas, five skandhas, five aggregates. That is the Rupa, Vedana, then Sanna is called, and Samskara and Vijnana. Five skandhas. When we are liberated from this attachment, we attain nirvana. That's the idea behind. Anyway, so I think today we already discussed a very important part of this Buddhist philosophy. So again, of course, we also will be able to attain our true identity or the reality of something that is non-dual, because Shunya is non-dual. It's a very important thing. Shunya as a philosophical concept is as non-dualistic as Brahman of Advaitins. And Nagarjuna surprisingly uses terms which later Shankaracharya used. See, Advayam, all that he uses. Beyond words, beyond description, beyond verbalization. Nagarjuna uses all these terms. Of course, you have to remember Nagarjuna was a highly educated Sanskritist, Vedantin also, because he all began with years-long Vedic chanting, Vedic studies and so on. He was born somewhere in South India as a traditional Brahmin Vedic scholar, who became a Buddhist, went to Nalanda and was a teacher there for a long time. And according to many traditions, many of the early Chinese pilgrims who came to India to study Buddhism were taught by him, by the great man Nagarjuna. And he also is supposed to have facilitated the transportation of a large number of Buddhist manuscripts from Nalanda when Xuanzang visited. Because it said that he carried huge camel loads, of manuscripts across the
That's a good idea.
desert. So Nagarjuna was a very, very, very great name, was a great figure in Buddhist tradition and supposed to be the greatest philosopher during the post-Buddha period. So anyway, so the idea of going beyond illusion and
on my end you're muted. So will the control room unmute the Swami, please?
Okay, now it's okay? Can you hear?
Now I can hear. Please.
Okay, yeah. So Nagarjuna, as I mentioned, was a great, he facilitated the transportation of a number of valuable Sanskrit manuscripts when Xuanzang was a student, and on his way back to China, he carried a large number of manuscripts on camel's back, across the Gobi desert. So again, it's a very important thing. I think I have just mentioned to you a few things about this interesting system of philosophy. Remember. Now you can ask questions if you are interested. We can have plenty of time, I believe, half an hour. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah, thank you.
I think what happened was somebody joined unmuted, and then you got muted by mistake. So,
I muted. Oh.
Oh well, now you're fine. So.
Did you miss some of my statements till now?
Very, very briefly, but I think you recapitulated it when you said that Nagarjuna was responsible for the transport of those manuscripts.
Yeah. So I want to mention, maybe it's good to keep this in mind. So in Madhyamika Karika, Nagarjuna uses terms which were later used by Shankaracharya in explaining the non-dual truth of Brahman. But again, Nagarjuna shows the influence of Upanishadic philosophy. For example, the Upanishads are full of statements. They talk of avang manasa gocharam, something beyond mind and words. Yato vacho nivartande aprapya manasa saha, that is in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Words and mind went in search of the supreme truth. They returned empty-handed, they could not see. Words and mind. There are many, many statements, hundreds. So again, Nagarjuna was a very traditional Sanskrit scholar who studied the Vedas for years. And then he became a Buddhist, and even his birthplace was not discovered till recent times, because he went to North India, went to Nalanda, and he to study Buddhism, and he became a Buddhist and then became a teacher, and he became eventually the greatest name in post-Buddha tradition, and he was the one who must have been an important acharya, teacher in Nalanda when Xuanzang came there to study Buddhism, and on his way back he is supposed to have carried a large number of manuscripts to China, and later of course to other. The influence spread beyond China in later years, Japan and other countries. These are all important, have been important strongholds of Mahayana Buddhism. So many great scholars in recent times, 20th century, Hajime Nakamura and others, was a great Japanese scholar. He knew, of course, he was a scholar in Chinese, Tibetan, all these languages. He had helped in retrieving some of the lost Sanskrit manuscripts from ancient Chinese translations, because many of the manuscripts in Nalanda University were destroyed when it was attacked by an invader, Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khilji, which I discussed earlier. He burnt libraries and tens of thousands of manuscripts were burned. So many of those books were later on retrieved with the help of translations which are available in Tibetan and Chinese languages. So Nagarjuna is a very important figure. You have to keep in mind that the idea that there are two fundamental ways of looking at the world of realities. One is the truth or reality. One is Loka Samburdhi Satyam, the other is Paramartha Satyam, which again is Nagarjuna's own statement. So I want to emphasize the point that Nagarjuna's Shunya is absolutely different from what we understand by the English translation, unfortunate translation, as nothingness or emptiness. That's what I want to emphasize. Okay, thank you. No question.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you.
Last time you said Shunyavada was asserting that Sarvam Anityam. But today you said Sarvam Nityam Vastu can be there.
So, okay, I understand what you are implying. Thank you for the question. This is a simple point, If you read any of the popular Vedanta texts, which are reference to Buddhism, especially Shunyavada, you find Shunyavada is interpreted as something like Mahavainasika, the great annihilators, the people who say there is nothing in this world. But mostly because many of the Vedantic texts were written at a time when Shunyavada was interpreted, came to be interpreted as what we mean by nothingness in English word translation. That's the point. So I mentioned to you in Sarvadasana Sangraha also. So, but that is not what Nagarjuna actually mentioned. So, in Shankaracharya's commentaries, there are discussions. I discussed this in the last class, Shankaracharya's Brahma Sutra Bhashya, which tries to refute the popular idea of Shunya prevalent at that time. That is, there is nothing, neither object nor subject, if there is nothing. So that was the popular idea of Shunyavada in 8th century. And he had to debate with those scholars. So those scholars argued not the way Nagarjuna would have argued. They argued trying to establish what we now understand by the English translation nothingness, which is certainly different from Nagarjuna's original meaning of Shunya. So whenever you hear anywhere, you have to remember this misunderstanding. It is very much there in the air. And also, of course, at the same time, I want to mention pretty clearly, great Buddhist teachers from either from Japan or Korea or China or Tibet or Burma. Of course, in Burma is the Hinayana system is more prominent. But you find in their original teachings, they do not, generally they do not make it appear as a shunya, nothingness or emptiness. The problem is when you read an English translation and saying that Avalokiteshvara was meditating upon nothingness or emptiness, and then you try to look at Shunyavada from the perspective of the English translation, emptiness. Instead of, you should try to look at emptiness from Shunya word perspective. But you look at Shunya from emptiness word perspective. That's a problem. So, if you start reading, if you start your study of Buddhism by reading a translation, which begins the discussion by saying that Buddha taught emptiness or Nagarjuna taught emptiness, You look at Oxford Dictionary, Chambers Dictionary, Webster Dictionary. Oh, empty, very clear, meaning is very clear. This glass is empty. This hall is empty. So everything is empty. So that's where the misunderstanding originates, That's the problem.
From a prescriptive perspective, in Vedanta we cultivate the sadhana chatushtaya, and then we do Shravana Manana, we do Atma Vichara, Shravana Manana, Nidhyasana.
Sadhana Chatushtaya Sampatti, Sarvana Manana Nidhyasana. All these are involved in the realization of the noble truths and also in the eightfold disciplines, really speaking. If you practice eightfold disciplines, it's all about sadhana chatushtaya sampatti. I mentioned in the last class, So anyone who turns to spiritual life will have all these qualities, will naturally be looking for something that is lasting, not going after all small little things. We have a sense of disregard for worldly enjoyments. We'll have a sense of sanctity and sacredness and have a strong desire for some kind of spiritual experience. And then we go to library reading those books, thinking about and discussing those things. So you can imagine. So somebody who is studying, who is trying to become a spiritual seeker in Christianity, Judaism, or Buddhism, Vedanta, or Hinduism, any tradition. What will he read if you go to library? Not a copy of the Terminator. He will be reading Bible, Sermon on the Mount, or Gita, Upanishads, Dhammapada, or any of those things that talk to you, that inform you something about some kind of higher possibility in spiritual life. Why? Because sadhana chatushtaya sampatti, the four important characteristics and qualities mentioned in the 19th verse of Vegachudamani by Shankaracharya, is common and universal. In any tradition, you automatically develop those qualities. Turn to spiritual life, you become endowed with those qualities. So you have to, Shankaracharya did not mean that you should take that book and read every word. No, he's talking about a certain spiritual transformations that happen to every sincere spiritual seeker as part of his spiritual journey. And that is universal in any tradition. Okay, thank you.
This is my question, this is my comment.
Yeah.
So I want to say Shunyavada is the absence of Maya.
Yeah. No, that is true. What you said is absolutely correct. You see, the Panchaskandhas, all the five aggregates that according to Prajnaparamita Sutra, it begins by saying Rupam, Vedana, Samjna, all these are devoid of inherent permanent existence. That's Maya only. What is Maya? Maya is nothing but the way of looking at the relative, the empirical. Because we are under the influence of Maya, we wrongly interpret the relative as the absolute, the impermanent as the permanent. When you get out of Maya, then also we look at the empirical world, but we see them and we won't consider the world of names and forms as something is permanent. Names and forms come and go, but there is a substance which is wrongly interpreted as consisting of names and forms. So Vedantin also lives in this world. He is also liberated from the bondage. What's a bondage? Looking at the world of names and forms as something permanent is bondage. Looking at life as a continuous journey because of desire, because of clinging, so going through different actions and samskaras and vrittis, dying, reborn again living, This continue, praditi samutpada. It is only a conditioned entity. It is not a permanent entity. It is interdependent. It is not independent. It is interdependent. The realization comes when you meditate upon Shunya, Prajna Paramita. That is the peak of wisdom, spiritual wisdom, according to the sutra. Same thing. Again, at the experience level, you find the same thing. If you closely observe great spiritual teachers or the teachings, you can see some kind of a unifying factors, harmonizing factors. A sense of sanctity and sacredness and self-restraint, self-control. All these are natural for anyone who is evolving. Of course, there are traditions that make you demons, the opposite. That also is there. That's because of lack of spiritual dimension in those traditions. But in any tradition where you follow the teachings of a genuine teacher, spiritual teacher, you find when you pray, when you meditate, when you try to be a good human being, when you show compassion to others, when you are non-violent, naturally you become self-restrained, you have sense control, you become more balanced. That's true. Now, as a spiritual journey, it is very, very common, very universal. Actually, we are in a way discussing these parallel systems of philosophy. It is also a kind of spiritual practice. It has got a tremendous spiritual implication. Study of philosophy, especially spiritual philosophy, from a spiritual perspective, has tremendous spiritual implication. Because it takes the mind far away from lower levels. And see, we are thinking of living in this world, looking at the whole creation as one spiritual family. Which all this, that's the meaning of compassion according to Avalokiteshvara. So when somebody begins to realize the name, form, perceptions, all emotions, all these panchaskandhas, they're all impermanent, coming and going to having real existence. Then you get out of this bondage. And then you develop a kind of spiritual common sense, so to speak. A spiritual common sense. Putting in simple, plain English, a kind of spiritual common sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Before Shay's question, I want to ask about, because you just referenced the benefits of the efforts at studying comparative religion.
Yeah.
So this is another level of comparative spirituality that intended to be more integrative and more pervasive than what you often experience in courses on comparative religion.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is, I think, what you were saying earlier about the nature of the translated works that are prepared. So I just wanted to make that point, that this is a rather unique analysis because the other approaches are hampered by those limitations that you mentioned.
Yeah. No, that what you said is absolutely correct, and I very much appreciate this statement. And I want to add one more important point, which is very valuable, I believe. That is, when we study and analyze translations without studying the fundamental teachings of the great teacher, which means you can at least read a good, reliable work, a small biography plus a small book of teachings. It should be genuine and authentic. And then read his philosophical ideas. Then we are less likely to be misled. For example, look at a man like Buddha. And we know that he renounced everything and he gave up everything. He meditated for a long time. He started teaching around, and he basically was a man of compassion. And then we try to understand his basic teachings, and when we come to, well, it is emptiness. He taught nothing but everything is empty. I mean, you cannot reconcile the personality of man like Buddha and the almost laughable idea that he taught nothing but everything is empty. That's what he taught. And he was meditating on this idea, everything is empty. We cannot be very wonderful focus on meditation. That's why I told, that Nagarjuna himself, and you can read this verse number 11 in Mula Madhyamika Karya, Arya Satya Pariksha, most probably 24th chapter. Vinashiri Duddrushta Sunida Mandamedasam. Mandamedasam means those, here Shankaracharya uses the word Alpamedasa, means, even Gita also, those who do not have very refined intellect. What they do, what happens, this teaching gets lost because it is misunderstood and misinterpreted. That's what happens. So Buddha himself said that, Nagarjuna says. So Nagarjuna puts in Buddha's mouth, actually, indirect, so to speak. Chandrakirti has written a very elaborate commentary on this. Chandrakirti commented on this Madhyamika, very well known Prasanna Pada. I don't think it has got an English translation, perhaps not, but it's a very important work. The only comprehensive commentary on Mula Madhyamika Karika or Madhyamika Karika of Nagarjuna is Chandrakirti's Prasanna Pada. It's an important work. Okay, thank you.
I looked for an English translation. There would be a good one or a bad one, but I could not find one, so I'll keep looking.
Oh, they may not have a translation, perhaps, I don't know. Yeah.
Perhaps not.
Yeah.
Shay?
First, Sanjay informed us this is the 100th session of fundamental texts. So thank you for these 100 Sunday sessions.
Yeah, thank you.
So my question is on this topic of the proper preparation of your intellect for understanding subtle spiritual concepts.
Yeah.
I think is a universal one, right? So, and I love this reversal of the analogy of the snake and the rope. You grab something, a concept that you think you understand, and you think it's benign, it's just a rope, but actually you don't really understand, right?
Yeah.
So, I think this is a common experience, especially for us who are householders. We engage with these topics not fully, right? For some of our time, but not fully. And the ego comes in and it says, I understand this deep topic that maybe we just received an introduction on. I'm wondering if you have practical advice for when the ego comes in and it makes us feel like we understand something, but we don't have that full proper preparation.
Yeah. Now, one way to develop the right mind to read these important spiritual books is to consider this as part of a spiritual journey, not just like an academic pursuit. See, I will tell you very frankly, in fact, those of you who are listening to this in the Zoom class and elsewhere, some of the questions that you ask are highly appreciated because they're coming from a very deep and sincere desire to go deeper into whatever we have understood. Now that cannot be expected with the same genuine thirst for more information from a university student very often, who is just eager to write a thesis or dissertation, which means collecting information from any source and putting together in a paper and getting a degree. Now, it doesn't make any difference for an academic whether Nagarjuna Shunya is understood properly or not. It's not much. From a spiritual sense, it's a disaster to interpret Shunya of Nagarjuna as emptiness of the English dictionary. totally disastrous. If you are a spiritual seeker, if you are a genuine Buddhist, you'll be totally lost. So, from a spiritual perspective, it is very vital to understand that Nagarjuna's Shunya is not the word emptiness in an English dictionary. Again, I mentioned to you that some of the discussions here are possible because we are not approaching it as a merely academic pursuit, but from a different perspective. And that perspective is an indication that mind is actually evolving. I mean, mind is getting purified. Mind is the meta, the purified intellect. So people may call it superstition. I know that this is possible. But they won't be able to even intellectually understand some of these higher truths unless our mind is ready for it. And mind becomes ready when we bring in the idea of sanctity, sacredness, kind of spiritual seriousness in studying the scriptures.
You may have already answered this, but is the word nirvana used in the Gita and used by Buddha, is that the same?
Yeah, as an experience, it's the same. See, in Gita, in the second chapter, there is a long description of the characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person. That is, in the 54th verse of the second chapter, Arjuna puts a question. Sthita prajnasya ka bhasha samadhisthasya keshava, etc. 54th verse. What are the characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person? Sthita prajna. Then there is a long discussion, a list of those qualities in 18 verses. And it comes Brahma Nirvanam Richati. So nirvana here means this transcendental experience, that level of spiritual realization which makes your intellect, everything stable, settled and serene. And that's what actually nirvana means. If you come back to Prajnaparamita Sutra, when you realize that we are distinct from the five aggregates, our true nature is not this phenomenal empirical thing called praditya samutpada. Rather, we are the absolute reality. So that experience will give you the same feeling, the experience in Buddhism will give you the same feeling which comes to you if you are following the path of Vedanta, Advaita or Gita. Same, no difference. But remember, the point is, Buddhist logic and Buddhist dialectics can be different. From a dialectical point of view, there is no end to conflicts. From a spiritual perspective, there is no scope at all for any conflicts. That's the idea. So thank you, all of you, and thank you again for making this possible, these underclasses on Indian philosophical systems. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.